Welcome, I'm Dr. Anand Senthi, and this is a summary version of the talk Evidence-Based Fraud and the End of Statistical Significance. The full version of the talk is available at our website ebm2.0.com, where point is spelt as a word. Now, what is this talk about? Well, there's a great scandal in medicine that most of the published research findings in the modern day of evidence-based medicine are false. And that's obviously a big problem. Now, this was revealed to us way back in 2003. Johnny Ioannidis published this landmark paper where he used statistical simulations to demonstrate that using the p-values that we're using, less than 0.05, and the way that we were practicing evidence-based medicine, that the majority of our findings that we think are true are going to turn out to be false. And he gave us a bunch of red flags to watch out for that make it more likely for your studies to be false. And they included if you had a small effect size, which I like to call the EBM double whammy, because if we have a small effect size, like an NNT of 100 or something like that, we don't even care because it's so small, and it's actually unlikely to be true at the same time. So we don't even care and unlikely to be true. The double whammy, where there's a greater number and lesser pre-selection of test relationships, where you've got loads of outcomes that you're testing, or you've got great flexibility in deciding how you design the study, your definitions, your outcomes, what analysis you do, where there's great conflicts of interest, and not just things like who's funding the study, but there's huge conflicts of interest that can exist, and we talk about this in the talk, in the longer version, and biological plausibility. It's critically important. It's been underestimated, the importance of this, and it links into a concept of pretest probability that we'll talk about some more. Now, he warned us about this back then, and yet we basically ignored him because most of our studies since that time have been guilty of breaking all of those rules. And so another key study came out in 2013 when Prasad published this paper, A Decade of Reversal. And what he did was they looked at the New England Journal of Medicine and for 10 years of their papers and looked at the original article section and found that 1 in 9 papers that were being published were actual reversals of a previous standard of care that had been established because we thought we'd prove something with a study and it turned out to be false later on. And then the other thing he found was when they were actually establishing, evaluating a standard of care practice, 40% of the times it became reversed and was found to be false. This was then expanded by Herrera Perez, and they looked at as well JAMA and the Lancet and combined this with the New England Medicine data and that Prasad had. And when you put it all together, they found that over 15 years there were 500 reversals of what we thought to be proven medical practice. And the worst part is this is just the tip of the iceberg, because the vast majority of findings that we've said are positive and it's establishing a new type of care, we just assume it's true and we never ever retest it and reevaluate it. And sometimes we're prevented from doing so because people argue it's unethical to do so, even though we've often built that standard of care on a single trial. So why is this happening? Why are we so bad at doing evidence-based medicine that so much of what we're publishing is false? The reasons are several, but some of the key reasons are there is so much bias in our research, and this is not new to us. We've known about this for a while, and there's so many different types of bias that, and we obviously try and diligently look for when we study trials. But one of the reasons we spend a bit of time in the full version of this talk going through examples of this is to show how insidious bias is, how difficult it is to detect, and how much bias is actually undetectable. And that we actually just have to assume it's there when we're interpreting our research. And I like to compare it to an example of, let's say you're walking between two villages and it's the middle of the night, and you're choosing whether you're going to walk between these two villages, and there's a dimly lit path that you can see with a bit of lighting, but around it you're surrounded by a massive forest which is completely black and you can't see anything. And on the path you can see, a couple of rabbits, a little squirrel here and there, maybe a little mouse now and then. No one too threatening, but you've heard there is a wolf in the night. You know this because you've heard of other villagers being eaten by such a wolf in the night. Now, when you're making a decision where you're going to walk down this path, you're not just going to say, there's only a few rabbits, nice little mouse, he's pretty cute, I'll go walking. You're going to price in and take into account the wolf in the night, the person, the animal that you can't see. In the evidence-based medicine world, undetectable bias is the wolf in the night that we have been willfully ignoring all this time. We've been having statements like, oh, well, we can only evaluate the research in front of us. No, we have to make assumptions about what research, what bias, and what findings and papers we can't see, because we've been finding out time and time again about all these examples of hidden data. The problem, one of the best examples of undetectable bias, is that researchers have no obligation whatsoever to report results that show negative findings for the whole trial, or suggest harm, or report any outcomes that are unfavorable and don't support their conclusions. They only have to publish, and only choose often to publish, the findings that are most favorable to what they're trying to prove. And the best example of this was another paper by Ioannidis published last year, that when they evaluated 25 years of research in the evidence-based medicine world, 96% of published p-values were less than 0.05. 96%. That is extraordinary. And why is it extraordinary? Because when you do science and you do research, the vast majority of everything that you test will be negative. The vast majority. And so every now and then you find a positive finding, and if we're only seeing basically all positive findings, there is a huge amount of data that we're not seeing. There's a huge amount of undetectable hidden bias, the wolf in the night, that we can't see. But we know it's there. It's plain as day that it's there. We've had example after example being told that it's there. Yet we're not pricing it in at all. And we're only interpreting this skewed fantasy world that we're seeing of just the most optimistic, polished version of the evidence without looking at the wolf in the night. But the other big issue, one of the other big issues, is that I don't think we fully appreciated that bias actually affects our statistical tests. We've always thought we've often felt that bias and statistics are two separate parts of the equation. But when we use the p-value, the p-value is testing several assumptions simultaneously. And one of the assumptions is that the null hypothesis is true. And we've always focused on that as being the key finding that we have to worry about, and the key assumption that we're testing. But actually, it's testing several assumptions simultaneously at once, and that's what the calculation is doing. And one of those assumptions is that there's effectively no bias in the study. No bias in the study. So if we come up with a p-value of 0.02 and there's bias in the study, that doesn't mean anything, right? That 0.02, because it doesn't mean anything about the null hypothesis anymore, because it's telling us that our data is incompatible because there was bias in the study. So bias actually affects the interpretation and the value of the numbers that we've been using to rely on when we're talking about p less than 0.05. It actually invalidates those numbers for our purposes. But we've not really, I think, fully appreciated that in our analysis. The real reason that, the big reason that most of our findings are false was revealed to us in this landmark article by Professor Regina Nuzzo in Nature 2014. This is apparently one of the most read Nature articles ever published. And what Professor Nuzzo revealed to us was that p-values, we have misinterpreted what they mean. From the time the evidence-based medicine started, we did not understand the p-value. We kind of thought that if you had a p of 0.05, it meant that there's a 5% chance that the null hypothesis was true, and therefore there's a 95% chance that our hypothesis was true. And we couldn't have been more wrong. The p-value is actually a likelihood ratio that tries to convert a pretest probability of our hypothesis into a post-test probability. So if we look at the left here, if there's a pretest probability that the null hypothesis is true of only 5%, and in general, that's probably a fair assumption for most clinical studies when we starting out to test their efficacy, because the vast majority of easy wins in evidence-based medicine with medications and therapies that work really well and have really low NNTs were found 20, 30 years ago, and now we're just trying to find really small benefits with very expensive, difficult effort and very expensive drugs, and most of the time they end up not to be working. So the actual pretest probability is probably quite small that anything that we're initially trialing is true. So let's say it's 5%, and then you have a p-value of 0.05. That converts your 5% to 11% chance of effect. 11%. Not 95%. 11%. That there is the key reason that we've got this EBM game totally wrong from the start. We were thinking that we were proving things to be true when we were just slightly budging the probability of them being true. It obviously gets better if your p-values are lower. If your p-value is 0.01, you get up to a 30% chance of being true. 30%. Still 70% chance that we are wrong. Now, let's say you've done a few studies, and a couple of studies after studies, and now you're building up your certainty of this finding being true. And now let's say you're going into a nice big study with a 50-50 toss-up of whether this could be true or not. Then yes, your p-values are better. At 0.05, you get 70% chance of being true. At 0.01, an 89% chance of being true, but still big chances that you're wrong. Now, as appalling as these numbers are compared to what we had believed the p-value meant to us, unfortunately, these are overestimates, gross overestimates, for two reasons. The ratios that these p-values are acting as likelihood ratios, and these likelihood ratios, or otherwise known as Bayes factors, that are used are the best possible version of events for a Bayes factor. That's what they call the Bayes factor bound, the highest possible Bayes factor. So this is the most optimistic possibility of that conversion. But as well as that, this doesn't price in bias. So if we've got bias in the study, these are grossly optimistic. So as appalling as these numbers are, this is an optimistic version of events of what our p-values do from our pre-test probability to our post-test probability. So this obviously went on long enough, and Nazo published a paper in 2014. We didn't change our ways. Nobody changed their ways. And so finally, the largest professional organization of statisticians in the world, the American Statistical Association, decided enough was enough, and they had to publish a paper, a position statement, on what the p-value actually is and how we should use it. And they made a number of statements, but one of the key statements was the p-values do not measure the probability that the study hypothesis is true or the probability that the data were produced by random chance alone. Hello, that's exactly what I thought the p-value was my entire medical career. It's exactly what we were all taught the p-value was. And this was earth-shattering to the evidence-based medicine world. Despite that, we still didn't change our ways. We kept on using the p-value and less than 0.05 and the same old bias and the same old stuff. And so then the ASA published an entire month's article last year, a whole month's edition dedicated to moving beyond p less than 0.05. And to me, this was kind of the equivalent of them now screaming at us, please, listen to us. You don't know what you're doing. So they made some key opening statements, and one was, don't believe that an association or effect exists just because it was statistically significant. And likewise, don't believe it doesn't exist just because it wasn't significant. If your p-value is 0.1, it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it's not a real finding. It just means we need to keep studying it. Just like if your p-value is less than 0.05. It's just converting a pre-test probability to a post-test probability that will almost always require further study. And don't conclude anything of scientific or practical importance based on statistical significance or lack thereof. Pretty damning. But their big recommendation, the game changer, was don't say statistical significance anymore, ever again. We are the statisticians and we have spoken. It is a meaningless term. It has no meaning to dichotomize into a positive negative based on a p-value of 0.05, especially from what we've seen. It shouldn't be used anymore, and we can't talk about evidence like that any longer. So what did they give us to replace this? They gave us the ATOM principle, which stands for accept uncertainty, be thoughtful, open, and modest. And in the full version of this talk, we spent a bit of time going through this principle with lots of examples of how it works and how we should be using it and not using it. So since then, scientists have been rallying across the world against the term statistical significance and ending our use of this phrase and this methodology. And it is time it hit the history books. So EBM 2.0 is a path I'm trying to chart for as a way forward for all of us to collaborate on. And what it is it's basically an understanding that what we're doing up to now, what I refer to as EBM 1.0, is fundamentally flawed. And we cannot go on with this any longer. We owe it to our patients to do better, much, much better. And so some of the key messages of EBM 2.0 an upgrade on EBM 1.0, is that we have to be savagely skeptical. We have to assume study findings are false, because that seems to be the case, until rigorously proven otherwise. Start skeptical and wait for replications of data to convince you. I often say make the data wine and dine you. Make it convince you. Make the data take you in one study, two studies, one date, 2 dates, 3 dates before you make that data your bedfellow. Make that data take you to a lovely restaurant with shiny p-values. And when you walk in, there's just not a hint of bias in this restaurant. Make that data wine you and dine you several times before you accept this study to be true. And as you progress through these studies and these dates, then you can be convinced. Also, accept uncertainty. Realize that there's no world of black and white positive and negative studies. They don't exist. There's no such thing as positive and negative. There's just studies that give us p-values and numbers that just slowly change our level of uncertainty until, hopefully, with enough data, we get to a level of certainty where we're happy to make change. So this displays that this is how each successive trial studying the same thing again and again, finding the same outcomes, will successively increase that pretest probability each time, up and up and up, until we get to a level of certainty that we're happy to change practice. It's just the certainty change model, where if you have a drug that is new and very expensive, with unknown harms, long-term harms particularly, and likely a fairly low benefit, because most of the new drugs that come out have relatively small benefits and high NNTs, then we really need the highest levels of certainty before we decide to change practice and bankrupt our systems by using this drug and exposing our patients to harm. And what should that be? I don't know, but maybe it should be 95% certainty, because that's what we thought we were getting before with our misunderstanding of the p-value. And that will take several studies and replications to get there. Whereas if you have a drug, let's say an old drug, that's pretty harmless and is well tolerated, it's very cheap, and seems to have reasonable benefit, we might be happy to change practice and start using it based on new data. When we're much less certain, 30, 40, 50% certain, we might be happy to change practice in that scenario. And so it really depends what the real world costs and benefits of the drug are before we decide to change practice. Other key take-home messages. We have to abandon the EBM 1.0 statistics, the p-values less than 0.5, statistical significance, and even confidence intervals, which we talked about in the big version of the talk. They're just the same dichotomous mistake as p-values less than 0.05. But we also need to replace that with the Bayesian approach of thinking, what is our overall probability of this thing being true? Bringing in all factors, the wolf in the night and the stuff that we can see, and pricing that in to evaluate how our probabilities have changed. Always pricing the wolf in the night. We are dealing with people's lives. We have to take in all possible likely information. And number 4, use EBM 2.0, obviously for the future of all the evidence that we do, but we have to go back and reevaluate the past with this new lens of EBM 2.0. And there are some obvious suspect candidates that need to be reevaluated. And do not be dissuaded by people saying it's unethical. It isn't. Many of these therapies are unproven, and our patients deserve to have them revalidated with this new lens now that we know. And we talk about that in the long version of the talk. And if you have been shaken by this and concerned about this, and that we need to change the way we practice, please spread the word. EBM2.0.com. Use the hashtag EBM2 in Twitter. Say you support it. Let everyone know about this so we can spread this, make this viral, and we can change the way we practice and interpret evidence-based medicine. Thank you for your time.